Run if you want the story, because in the next 30 seconds, one quiet decision will change two lives forever. The afternoon sun bounced off the glass towers of downtown Chicago, turning every window into a mirror that reflected flashing cameras and anxious faces. Reporters crowded the front entrance of Hayes Dynamics headquarters shoulder to shoulder, each hoping to capture a headline that would dominate the evening news. Questions flew through the air before anyone could answer them. Camera shutters clicked without pause. Television crews stretched microphones toward the revolving doors as if persistence alone could force the truth into daylight. Charlotte Hayes paused just inside the lobby, taking one slow breath before the security team signaled that the exit had become impossible. At 36, she had built one of the most respected technology companies in America, but success had come with a price no balance sheet could measure. Every public appearance had become a performance. Every smile belonged to strangers. Every quiet moment disappeared beneath the weight of expectations. Outside, the noise only grew louder. One reporter spotted movement behind the glass and shouted her name. Another lifted a camera above the crowd. Security exchanged worried glances, scanning for an opening that no longer existed. A black luxury SUV waited at the curb, trapped behind media vans and a wall of photographers. Then, almost unnoticed, an aging blue pickup truck rolled slowly toward the opposite side of the street. It wasn't polished. It wasn't expensive. It looked like it had earned every mile on American highways. Behind the wheels sat Ethan Walker, a 39-year-old mechanic from Maple Creek who had driven into the city to pick up specialty engine parts before heading back to his small repair shop. He noticed the growing crowd before he understood who stood at the center of it. He watched the exhaustion on one woman's face, not the designer suit or the expensive shoes. He saw someone searching for a simple way home. Without hesitation, Ethan eased his truck beside the sidewalk where no cameras were pointing, stepped out, and quietly opened the passenger door. He didn't wave. He didn't call attention to himself. He simply nodded toward the empty seat, as though helping a stranger cross the street were the most ordinary thing in the world. Charlotte looked across the sea of flashing lights and noticed the man waiting without expectation. There was no curiosity in his eyes, no excitement, no calculation. Only calm. Security hesitated, but the narrow opening appeared for only a heartbeat. Charlotte trusted the silent invitation. She crossed quickly, slipping between two distracted camera operators before climbing into the warm passenger seat. Ethan closed the door gently, returned behind the wheel, and pulled away with the same patience he used leaving his neighborhood grocery store. The reporters realized too late that the woman they had surrounded had vanished. Frustrated voices echoed behind them as the pickup disappeared into afternoon traffic. Inside the cab, silence settled naturally. The truck smelled faintly of fresh coffee, clean motor oil, and pine air freshener. Family photos rested on the dashboard beside a faded drawing of a smiling little girl holding her father's hand beneath a bright yellow sun. Charlotte studied the picture before looking toward the road. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan smiled without taking his eyes off the traffic ahead. "Everybody deserves a little breathing room," he replied. She expected questions about her company, her wealth, or to the headlines filling every financial website in America. None came. Instead, Ethan asked whether she needed to be dropped somewhere safe before he continued toward the interstate. That simple kindness felt unfamiliar. For the first time in years, Charlotte wasn't treated like a billionaire, a celebrity, or a headline. She was simply another passenger in an old pickup driven by a man who believed respect should never depend on someone's name. Neither of them realized that the quiet ride through Chicago would become the beginning of a story neither success nor money could have written. The drive ended only a few blocks from a quiet side entrance where Charlotte could continue her day without another wave of cameras. She reached for the door handle, then paused as if searching for words that felt ordinary enough to match the kindness she had just received. "I never even asked your name," she admitted with a grateful smile. Ethan shrugged lightly before answering. "Ethan Walker." She repeated it softly, committing it to memory without realizing why. "Charlotte," she replied simply, offering only her first name. Ethan nodded politely, wished her a peaceful afternoon, and drove away before she disappeared through the building. He never looked back. For him, the city had simply offered another stranger who needed a little help. By the time the sun settled lower across the Illinois sky, he was already heading west toward Maple Creek with a truck bed full of engine parts and a mind occupied by invoices, repair orders, and the promise he had made to his daughter that he would be home before dinner. Maple Creek welcomed him with familiar streets lined by old maple trees, modest brick storefronts, and neighbors who greeted one another by name. His repair garage sat beside the town's only diner, a place where pickup trucks outnumbered luxury cars and people measured wealth by trust instead of titles. Ethan unlocked the garage, carried the new parts inside, and smiled when he heard a cheerful voice call from the office. "Dad, you made it before 6. Lily hurried toward him, wrapping both arms around his waist before he could set down the heavy boxes. At 11 years old, she had inherited her father's gentle heart and endless curiosity. She noticed grease on his hands before anything else. "Busy day?" she asked. Ethan laughed quietly. "Busy enough." Together they finished closing the garage, wiping down workbenches, organizing tools, and checking tomorrow's appointments. Every movement reflected years of routine built on responsibility rather than convenience. While preparing dinner in their small kitchen, Lily talked excitedly about school, her science project, and the stray orange cat she hoped would eventually trust her enough to come closer. Ethan listened with complete attention, responding with the same patience he offered every customer who entered his garage. Nothing about the evening suggested that the world outside Maple Creek had changed. After dinner, they washed dishes together, and Lily taped another colorful drawing onto the refrigerator. It showed a small blue pickup beneath a bright sky with the words, "Best Dad Ever," written in careful letters. Ethan smiled at the picture, not because life was perfect, but because moments like these reminded him that ordinary days often carried the greatest blessings. Hundreds of miles away, Charlotte sat alone inside her spacious executive office long after the final meeting had ended. The city lights sparkled beyond the windows, but they failed to capture her attention. Instead, her thoughts returned again and again to the quiet mechanic who had offered help without asking for recognition. She had spent years surrounded by ambitious people eager to gain something from every introduction, every conversation, every favor. Ethan had expected nothing. His old pickup truck, the child's drawing resting on the dashboard, the smell of fresh coffee, and his calm voice stayed with her more vividly than the applause from shareholders earlier that morning. She opened her calendar for the following week, then closed it again without making another appointment. For reasons she could not explain, one simple question echoed through the silence of the office. Who was Ethan Walker when nobody was watching? The following Monday arrived with the same quiet rhythm Ethan had known for years, but hundreds of miles away another week began very differently. Charlotte entered the executive boardroom before 8 o'clock, greeted directors, approved investment reports, reviewed acquisition proposals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and listened carefully as department leaders outlined ambitious plans for the next quarter. She answered every question with confidence. Yet part of her attention drifted somewhere far beyond polished conference tables and financial projections. More than once, she caught herself remembering the peaceful silence inside an old blue pickup truck, where no one had expected anything from her except to arrive safely. After the final presentation ended, her chief of staff noticed that she remained seated while everyone else gathered their documents. "Is there anything else you need?" he asked politely. Charlotte hesitated for only a moment before replying, "I would like to find someone." The request surprised him. Normally, private investigators were hired only for major business matters. "Who are we looking for?" he asked. "A mechanic named Ethan Walker," she answered. "He lives somewhere called Maple Creek." There was no further explanation. Within an hour, her security director quietly assigned 2 experienced investigators to locate the small repair shop without attracting unnecessary attention. Charlotte specifically instructed them not to disturb Ethan or his family. "I only want to know where he works," she said. "Nothing more." Meanwhile, life in Maple Creek continued exactly as it always had. Ethan spent the morning replacing brake pads on a retired teacher's sedan before helping a young couple prepare their aging minivan for a summer road trip. Every customer received the same careful attention regardless of the age of the vehicle or the size of the repair bill. Around lunchtime, Lily walked from school carrying her backpack and a paper bag with homemade sandwiches. She smiled as she entered the garage, already knowing where her father would be. "You forgot your lunch again," she teased. Ethan laughed and accepted the sandwich with grateful eyes. "I guess I have someone looking out for me." She nodded proudly. "That is my job." Several longtime customers smiled at the familiar exchange before returning to conversations about baseball, weather, and weekend fishing plans. Nothing in the little garage hinted that people from one of America's largest corporations were quietly searching for its owner. Late that afternoon, the investigators finally arrived in Maple Creek. Instead of introducing themselves, they parked across the street and simply observed. They watched Ethan explain repairs honestly to an elderly customer, refusing to recommend unnecessary work that would have increased the bill. They saw him stop what he was doing to help a little boy retrieve a runaway bicycle rolling toward the sidewalk. They noticed Lily sweeping the office floor while laughing with her father, as though work and family naturally belonged together. One investigator lowered his notebook and quietly remarked, "He is exactly the kind of man people hope still exists." That evening, a brief report reached Charlotte's desk. It contained only basic information: the name of the repair shop, a photograph of the modest building, confirmation that Ethan was raising his daughter alone, and one final sentence written by the investigator after hours of observation. It read, "His reputation in town is built entirely on honesty." Charlotte stared at the page for several silent moments before closing the folder with a gentle smile. Wealth had introduced her to thousands of impressive people, but somehow the man who owned the smallest garage in Maple Creek had become the one person she wanted to meet again. 3 days later, a silver sedan rolled quietly into Maple Creek just after 10 o'clock on a bright autumn morning. There were no television cameras, no security convoy, and no formal announcement. Charlotte had insisted on making the trip with only her driver, asking him to park a short distance away so she could walk the final few yards alone. She wanted her arrival to feel ordinary, even if nothing about her public life ever truly was. The little repair garage looked exactly like the photograph she had studied. Wind chimes swayed gently beside the office door. A faded American flag moved lazily in the breeze. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with motor oil drifted into the crisp air. Inside, Ethan stood beneath the raised hood of an aging pickup truck, tightening the final bolt before lowering the hood with practiced hands. When the office door opened, he glanced up with the familiar smile he offered every customer. "Good morning. I will be with you in just a second." Charlotte waited patiently, watching him finish the job before turning his full attention toward her. "What can I help you with today?" he asked. She smiled, amused that he showed no sign of recognition. "You really do not remember me, do you?" Ethan studied her face for a brief moment. Something seemed familiar, but without flashing cameras and shouting reporters, she looked completely different from the woman he had quietly driven through downtown Chicago. Then the memory settled into place. His eyes widened slightly before he laughed softly. "You are Charlotte." She nodded. "I wanted to thank you properly." Ethan wiped his hands with a clean shop towel and motioned toward the small office. "Well, around here, thanking someone usually comes with a cup of coffee." Charlotte laughed, surprised by how naturally the words eased every trace of formality between them. The office was simple and welcoming, filled with family photographs, local baseball schedules, children's artwork, and handwritten thank you notes from longtime customers. Nothing had been arranged to impress anyone, and that authenticity made every detail feel more valuable. Before either of them could continue the conversation, the office door burst open with cheerful energy. "Dad, I forgot my..." Lily stopped in the middle of her sentence as she noticed the visitor. She looked from Charlotte to her father and back again with wide, curious eyes. "Wait," she said excitedly. "You are the lady from the news." Charlotte smiled warmly and crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "I guess I am." Lily grinned. "Dad helped you, did he not?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck with a modest smile. It was not a big deal. Lily quickly corrected him. Helping people is always a big deal. Charlotte looked at the young girl, then back at Ethan, realizing where his quiet character truly came from. Kindness was not something he performed for strangers. It was simply the way he lived every day, and his daughter had learned the same lesson by watching him. As the three of them shared fresh coffee and homemade cookies that a neighbor had delivered that morning, the conversation drifted naturally from cars to school, from small-town festivals to favorite family recipes. No one mentioned stock prices, board meetings, or billion-dollar contracts. For the first time in many years, Charlotte found herself losing track of time without checking a schedule. When she finally stood to leave, Ethan walked her to the door. "You're always welcome here," he said sincerely. Charlotte looked back at the modest garage glowing beneath the afternoon sunlight, then at the man who still treated her no differently than anyone else who walked through that door. Quietly, she realized she had not driven to Maple Creek simply to say thank you. She had come because this small place felt more like home than any penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline ever had. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm that neither Ethan nor Charlotte had planned. Every Thursday, after finishing her final morning meeting in Chicago, Charlotte quietly drove to Maple Creek without notifying reporters, assistants, or members of her executive team. She left her tailored jacket in the back seat before stepping into the familiar repair garage, wearing simple sweaters and blue jeans that allowed her to blend naturally into the peaceful little town. Ethan never treated those visits like special occasions. He simply handed her a fresh cup of coffee, smiled, and continued working while inviting her to stay as long as she liked. That simple acceptance became the greatest gift she had received in years. She was not expected to impress anyone. She did not need to explain quarterly earnings or answer difficult questions about market performance. She could simply exist. Before long, Lily began looking forward to Thursdays almost as much as weekends. She proudly showed Charlotte her latest school projects, invited her to help decorate cupcakes for the annual church fundraiser, and insisted that she join them for dinner whenever she visited. One cool evening, they walked together across the street to the small family diner where nearly everyone knew Ethan by name. The waitress greeted them with warm smiles before asking, "The usual for you, Ethan?" He nodded with a quiet laugh. Charlotte studied the easy conversations happening around the room. Farmers discussed the coming harvest beside retired teachers. High school students celebrated after football practice while grandparents shared slices of homemade apple pie. Nobody cared about headlines or corporate rankings. People cared about neighbors. When their meals arrived, Ethan thanked the waitress by name and asked about her husband's recent surgery. Charlotte noticed how naturally he remembered details about everyone around him. Respect was not something he reserved for important people. It was simply how he lived. After dinner, the three of them wandered through the town square, where children chased one another beneath strings of warm lights hanging between old brick buildings. A local musician played familiar country songs while families gathered on park benches, enjoying the cool autumn evening. Lily slipped her hand into Charlotte's without hesitation as they crossed the street together. Charlotte looked down with surprise before smiling gently. The small hand resting in hers felt strangely comforting. She realized she had spent years signing contracts worth extraordinary amounts of money, yet nothing compared to the quiet trust of one little girl who believed she belonged beside them. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep in the truck during the short drive home, Ethan carried her carefully inside the house before returning to the porch where Charlotte stood admiring the peaceful sky filled with stars. Neither of them hurried to speak. The silence felt complete instead of uncomfortable. Finally, Charlotte smiled softly and said, "I used to believe success meant building the biggest company possible." Ethan leaned against the porch railing and looked across the quiet neighborhood. "And now?" he asked. She watched warm light glowing through the kitchen window where Lily's school backpack rested beside tomorrow's lunchbox. "Now I think success might be having one place where people are happy to see you before they know your job title." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "My father always said that a good home is worth more than the nicest address." Charlotte smiled again, feeling those simple words settle deep within her heart. For the first time in many years, she found herself wondering whether everything she had spent a lifetime building was leading her toward the life she truly wanted, or quietly carrying her farther away from it. Autumn slowly settled over Maple Creek, painting the streets with shades of amber and gold, while life inside the little repair garage continued with its familiar rhythm. Yet beyond the quiet town, another story had already begun to spread. A financial columnist noticed that Charlotte's schedule included frequent, unexplained trips outside Chicago. A photographer recognized her silver sedan parked near the town square one Thursday afternoon. Within days, speculation filled business websites and television panels. Nobody knew why one of the most influential chief executive officers in America kept disappearing to a place that barely appeared on most maps. At Hayes Dynamics headquarters, the questions became impossible to ignore. During a quarterly strategy meeting, one board member carefully closed his presentation before looking directly at Charlotte. The media is beginning to ask whether these visits represent a personal relationship that could affect the company's public image. The room fell silent. Charlotte answered with complete composure. My personal time remains exactly that. Personal. Another executive shifted uneasily before adding, public perception influences investor confidence. We have to consider how these stories may develop. Charlotte thanked everyone for their concern, ended the meeting with professional courtesy, and walked back to her office without revealing how heavily those words weighed on her heart. Meanwhile, Maple Creek remained blissfully unaware of the growing attention. Ethan spent Saturday morning helping a volunteer firefighter repair an old pickup truck before joining Lily at the community park for the annual Autumn Festival. Families gathered beneath colorful trees, while local musicians performed on a small wooden stage. Fresh apple cider, homemade pies, and cheerful laughter filled the cool afternoon air. Charlotte arrived quietly just before noon, dressed simply enough that only a few local residents recognized her from television. She carried a homemade pumpkin pie from a bakery in Chicago, after remembering Lily had once mentioned it was her favorite. Lily greeted her with a joyful hug before eagerly pulling her toward the festival games. For several peaceful hours, they enjoyed simple moments that money could never purchase. They shared hot cider, laughed during a pie baking contest, and applauded children performing school songs beneath strings of warm lights. Ethan watched Charlotte smile more freely than he had ever seen before. She belonged in those ordinary moments far more naturally than she seemed to belong inside towering glass boardrooms. Late that afternoon, however, the quiet atmosphere shifted. Several unfamiliar sport utility vehicles rolled slowly into town, followed by photographers carrying professional cameras with long lenses. Someone had traced Charlotte's routine to Maple Creek. Curious whispers spread across the festival as camera shutters began clicking from a respectful distance. Ethan noticed Charlotte's smile fade the instant she realized what had happened. Lily looked from one adult to the other, sensing the sudden change without fully understanding it. Charlotte lowered her eyes and spoke softly. I'm sorry. I never wanted this to reach your town. Ethan looked calmly toward the photographers before turning back to her with the same steady expression he had worn on the day they first met in Chicago. You did not bring trouble, he said quietly. People followed a story because they did not understand it. Charlotte nodded, grateful for his reassurance, yet she understood something he had not fully seen. The attention would not disappear after one afternoon. It would grow louder with every visit, every photograph, and every headline. As the sun disappeared behind the maple trees, the first online articles were already appearing across the country, asking why America's celebrated billionaire chief executive officer kept returning to the garage of an unknown single father in a forgotten little town. Monday morning arrived beneath gray skies that seemed to mirror Charlotte's thoughts as she walked through the front doors of Hayes Dynamics. Every hallway conversation stopped for a brief moment before quietly resuming after she passed. Headlines about her repeated visits to Maple Creek had spread far beyond financial news. Television commentators debated her personal choices as though they were corporate strategy. Social media transformed ordinary photographs into endless speculation. Investors requested meetings. Public relations advisors prepared carefully worded statements that Charlotte never approved. By the end of the afternoon, the chairman of the board asked to speak with her privately. He closed the office door gently before saying, "Charlotte, everyone respects your leadership, but this story is becoming larger than the company can ignore. People are asking questions that have nothing to do with technology or business." Charlotte listened calmly without interrupting. "And what answer would satisfy them?" she asked. The chairman sighed, perhaps creating some distance until public attention moves elsewhere. Charlotte thanked him politely, but his words remained with her long after the conversation ended. Hundreds of miles away, Ethan noticed small changes in Maple Creek that had never existed before. Strangers occasionally drove past the garage without stopping for repairs. Cameras appeared at the end of the street for a few minutes before disappearing again. Curious visitors entered the diner, hoping to glimpse the famous executive they had seen on television. Ethan refused every interview with the same quiet response. "There is no story here. There are only good people trying to live honest lives." The attention gradually reached Lily as well. One afternoon after school, a classmate asked whether she was going to become rich because her father knew a billionaire. Lily answered with innocent certainty, "My dad was already rich. He has me." When Ethan heard those words later that evening, he smiled with pride, but Charlotte's heart would have broken if she had heard them. She realized that every new headline carried consequences for the family she had grown to love. That Thursday never came. Instead of driving to Maple Creek, Charlotte remained alone in her office long after sunset. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows while an untouched cup of coffee grew cold beside her desk. She opened a blank sheet of stationery and stared at it for several minutes before finally beginning to write. Every sentence came slowly because every word mattered. She thanked Ethan for reminding her that genuine respect still existed. She thanked Lily for showing her that trust could be given freely instead of earned through success. She admitted that the happiest hour she had experienced in years had taken place inside a small garage, a family diner, and a quiet home where nobody cared about quarterly earnings. Then her handwriting became noticeably smaller. She explained that she could no longer allow endless attention from the media to follow them into their peaceful town. If staying away was the only way to protect the life they had built together, then that was the choice she had to make. She folded the letter carefully, addressed the envelope in her own handwriting, and asked a trusted courier to deliver it personally the following morning. At sunrise, the envelope rested on Ethan's workbench beside the first repair order of the day. He recognized Charlotte's handwriting immediately. As the garage door slowly rolled open and morning light spilled across the floor, he read every line in complete silence. When he reached the final sentence, he lowered the letter, looked toward the empty road outside, and understood with quiet certainty that some people were simply too important to let walk away without hearing the truth from the heart. The letter remained folded inside Ethan's jacket pocket throughout the morning as he finished every repair he had promised his customers. He refused to rush because he believed commitments still mattered, even when his own heart felt unsettled. Only after closing the garage early did he ask his neighbor to watch over the shop for the afternoon. Lily noticed him gathering his keys and quietly walked over with a small paper bag. "You forgot your lunch again," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan laughed softly before accepting it. "Thank you." She looked at him carefully, recognizing the thoughtful expression she had seen only a few times before. "Are you going to see Charlotte?" she asked. Ethan nodded honestly. "I think she deserves a conversation instead of a letter." Lily wrapped her arms around him for a brief hug. "Tell her she still has a place at our table." Those simple words stayed with him for every mile of the drive toward Chicago. Late that afternoon, Hayes Dynamics prepared for its annual innovation conference, where investors, business leaders, employees, and journalists filled the grand auditorium. Charlotte stood backstage reviewing her remarks, but the carefully prepared speech no longer reflected what she truly wanted to say. Every sentence about growth, expansion, and financial success suddenly felt incomplete. Just before she was introduced, her assistant quietly approached. "There is someone here asking to see you," she whispered. Charlotte looked toward the hallway and froze. Ethan stood near the entrance wearing his familiar blue work jacket and holding the folded letter in one hand. He had driven nearly 300 miles simply to speak with her face to face. She walked toward him without hesitation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the audience faded behind the heavy theater doors. Ethan finally held out the envelope. "I read every word," he said gently. Charlotte lowered her eyes. "Then you know why I had to leave." Ethan shook his head. "I know why you thought you had to leave." She looked back at him with quiet sadness. "I could not let my life take away your peace." Ethan smiled with the same calm warmth that had first welcomed her into his old pickup truck. "Charlotte, peace is not something that disappears because people start talking. It disappears when good people stop showing up for each other." His words settled into the silence between them. He continued, "Lily asked me to tell you something before I left Maple Creek." Charlotte listened carefully. "She said you still have a place at our table." Charlotte felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness, but from finally hearing the truth she had been trying to silence inside herself. At that moment, the conference host announced her name, and applause echoed through the auditorium. Charlotte glanced toward the stage, then back at Ethan. For years, she had believed every important decision happened inside boardrooms. Now the most important decision of her life waited in a quiet hallway beside a man who had never asked her to become anyone except herself. She reached for his hand and smiled with peaceful certainty. "Come with me," she said, softly. Together, they walked onto the stage before thousands of guests. The audience applauded politely, then gradually fell silent as everyone noticed the unfamiliar mechanic standing beside the celebrated chief executive officer. Charlotte set her prepared speech aside. Looking across the room, she spoke with calm confidence. "Today I was supposed to talk about innovation and success. Instead, I want to tell you about the man who reminded me that character will always matter more than status, and that a life filled with genuine kindness is the greatest achievement anyone can build." The room remained completely still, and for the first time in years, Charlotte felt absolutely free. The applause faded into a silence that carried more meaning than any standing ovation Charlotte had ever received. "No imbécil interruptive." No reporter shouted another question. For several unforgettable seconds, an entire auditorium simply listened as truth replaced speculation. When she finished speaking, she turned toward Ethan with quiet gratitude, and he smiled with the same humble expression that had welcomed her into an old pickup truck on a crowded afternoon weeks earlier. He had never tried to change her world. He had only reminded her what truly mattered inside it. The following morning, newspapers across America published photographs from the conference, but the headlines surprised everyone. Instead of focusing on rumors or controversy, they spoke about integrity, kindness, and a remarkable speech that reminded millions that success without character was never complete. Public reaction shifted almost overnight. Employees wrote letters thanking Charlotte for showing genuine humanity. Customers praised her honesty. Even several board members privately admitted that her decision had strengthened respect for the company instead of weakening it. Business continued, but something far more valuable had changed. Charlotte no longer measured every choice by public approval. A week later, she returned to Maple Creek, this time without hiding her destination. The same silver sedan rolled slowly past familiar storefronts before stopping outside the little repair garage. Ethan looked up from replacing a battery and smiled as though she had only been gone for a single afternoon. Lily hurried from the office with joyful excitement before wrapping Charlotte in a warm hug. "I knew you would come back," she said proudly. Charlotte laughed softly. "I promised myself I would never forget where I found real happiness." Life gradually settled into a new and peaceful rhythm. Charlotte continued leading Hayes Dynamics with wisdom and determination, but she no longer allowed endless meetings to consume every hour of every day. Every Thursday evening belonged to Maple Creek. Sometimes she helped Lily with homework at the kitchen table. Sometimes she sat on a wooden stool inside the garage while Ethan finished repairing another neighbor's truck. Sometimes all three of them shared quiet dinners at the little diner, where the waitress no longer introduced Charlotte as a famous chief executive officer. She simply smiled and asked, "The usual tonight?" That simple question became one of Charlotte's favorite sounds in the world. Winter eventually gave way to spring, and colorful flowers returned to front porches throughout town. One Saturday afternoon, neighbors gathered for a community picnic beside the small lake outside Maple Creek. Children played catch beneath bright blue skies while local musicians filled the air with familiar songs. Ethan stood beside the picnic tables serving homemade lemonade when Charlotte walked toward him carrying a fresh apple pie. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. They had both discovered that the greatest miracles rarely arrived with noise. They appeared quietly, one ordinary act of kindness at a time. Lily looked from one of them to the other before smiling with complete confidence. She reached for Charlotte's hand with one hand and Ethan's with the other, gently bringing them together as they walked toward the lake beneath the warm afternoon sun. Around them, neighbors continued laughing, children continued playing, and life moved forward with peaceful simplicity. There were no flashing cameras waiting beyond the trees, no voices demanding explanations, and no walls separating two different worlds. There was only a modest town, an honest mechanic, a courageous woman who had learned that love was never measured by wealth, and a little girl whose unwavering faith had quietly brought them together. As the golden light settled across the calm water, Charlotte looked toward the small home waiting beyond the maple trees and finally understood that every road she had traveled, every difficult decision she had faced, and every success she had achieved had led her to the one place where she never needed to prove who she was. She had found a family that valued quiet dignity above status, grace above applause, and second chances above first impressions. And in that peaceful silence, all three of them finally felt at home.